Today's daf we're going to be learning is Ketubot daf tzadi zayin. We're going to get started at the top of the daf. Everyone. Kitzad mocheret. So our main topic today is going to be a woman whose husband died, and she is going to take some of the property of the orphans, and she's going to sell it. So the question is, there's going to be two reasons she's selling it. One is for mizonot, for food, and one is for ketuba. Let's just go through some basic rules again. A woman whose husband dies, as opposed to a woman who's divorced, we'll get to that in a minute. A woman whose husband dies gets food payments she wants until such point that she collects her ketuba. When she collects her ketuba, she can no longer get food payments. Okay, we talked about that there were different stages, right? Also, once she goes to get married, she can't get food payments anymore. Even if, let's say, she doesn't demand her ketuba or doesn't go get her ketuba, she's still, once she's already getting married to somebody else, she can no longer get mizonot from the estate. A divorcee doesn't get the food payments. She just gets, remember, the ketuba is a one lump sum payment as opposed to the mizonot, which are monthly payments. So a woman, it's in her best interest if she's a widow to continue getting the monthly payments until she can no longer get them anymore, and then she'll get her one lump sum of the ketuba. So now we have an issue, because so the divorcee doesn't get mizonot, she just gets the one lump sum, and that's the ketuba. We'll get back to the divorcee later. Now we're talking about a widow who wants to sell the property of the orphans. Let's say they don't have money to pay her the mizonot, so she takes some of the property of the husbands and she sells it. Now, what's the issue? The issue is that she can only take from it what she needs for mizonot. So, and mizonot, let's say, okay, in another 6 months she gets remarried. So let's say she sold a piece of land that's worth a year's worth of food payments. She took all the money, and now in 6 months, she goes and gets married. The orphans are going to be out of that money then. Really, she should have only gotten 6 months of mizonot payments. So you might say, okay, so have her sell property by the month. Normally, mizonot payments were done once a month. So let her sell property that's enough to cover her for the month. And the next month, she'll sell property enough to cover her for the next month, etc. Two problems with that. Number one, pain in the neck for her to be selling property all the time. Number two, we have another issue, which is try to sell a little chunk of land, right? That's worth 1 month of mizonot payments for one woman, right? How much land are you going to be able to sell? Who's going to want to buy a little corner of your field? It's not worth a lot of money to them. So if you want to sell a little teeny portion of your land, you're going to get a lesser price per square meter or square foot. So therefore, the rabbis said, well, how is she supposed to sell this? And how do we resolve? On the one hand, we want to make sure she gets a good price for it, because otherwise the orphans will take a loss. On the other hand, we don't want her to take too much money, because also then the orphans could take a loss. Let's say she gets married tomorrow and then they're out of money. So they come up with this solution. Amal Rabbi Daniel Barav Katina, Amal Rav Huna. Okay, this is quoted in the name of Rav Huna. We're going to have Machlok Rav Huna, Rav Yehuda. Mocheret echat l'shneim chodesh. She sells a plot that will cover her for 12 months, because any smaller than that is just, you're going to get a bad price. But the buyer only pays her in installments of once a month. And that way, every month she gets a payment, the first of the month. So he's going to pay off this money over the course of a year. If she gets married after 6 months, let's say, so the payment after that month will go to the children. The orphans will get it. And that way, we won't end up with any kind of situation. Worst case, she'll get a few extra days of food payments, but it won't be like a whole, half a year's worth. Rabbi Yehuda Amar, mocheret l'shisha chodeshim, v'lokech mefarnes echat l'shloshim yom. He thinks 6 months is already, to sell a piece of land that will cover her for 6 months of food payments, already won't be such a loss. He says better to do that because, why? What's the worst case? The worst case is she gets married and then the kids will get the payments, but maybe the kids would prefer the land. So they don't necessarily want to sell this land. If they did, they would have sold it, right? So therefore, he says, let's do 6 months. Better to sell a plot for 6 months, and then she'll get, again, her payments once a month. Tanya kavatei de Rav Yehuda, de Rav Huna, mocheret l'shneim chodesh, v'lokech mefarnes echad l'shloshim yom. Here's a braitot supports Rav Huna. It says exactly what he said. And Tanya kavatei de Rav Yehuda, and there's a braitot that supports Rav Yehuda, which basically means what they were arguing about was also machloket before them in the Tannaitic time period. Here's the braitot like Rav Yehuda, mocheret l'shisha chodeshim, v'lokech mefarnes echad l'shloshim yom. So machloket again, between also Tanaim, does she sell it for a month, for 6 months, or does she sell it for a year? Amar Amemar now comes to Paskin. He says, so he holds like Rav Yehuda, 6 months. Amar le Rav Ashi la Amemar, to Rav Huna mai. So he says to Amemar, Rav Ashi says to him, what did you do with Rav Huna's position? You just ignored it? To which he says, basically, yeah. Amar le lo shmi ali, said I never heard it, which the Gemara tells you, klomal lo svir ali, which means that doesn't mean I never heard it. I'd heard in the Gemara often doesn't mean tashma, come and learn, it means, right? It doesn't mean I heard. It means I learned, meaning lo svir ali, I don't learn that way. I don't hold that way. So that was the first sugya. That's really easy. Okay, not all of today is going to be so easy, but that was an easy sugya. Basically, how does she sell the land? She sells either once a year, or a piece that will cover for a year, or a piece that will cover for 6 months. Either which way, everyone agrees that she only gets payments of once a month. So she gets going to get the payments for this land she sold in monthly installments. Now they asked Rav Sheshet another question. This is an interesting one. Now remember that when a husband marries a wife, all of his property from that moment on becomes what we call mishu'abad, and it's liened to the ketuba. So any sale he makes of land can always be collected by her to collect her ketuba, which is going to include this piece of land that she now sold to, right, of the orphans for her food payments. Okay, it's also lien to her ketuba. So comes the students of Rav Sheshet and ask a good question. If she sells land of his for her mizonot, for her food payments, can she then go back and collect that land from the buyer and say, oh, but wait, I'm owed ketuba money now, and all his land is no longer in his, we don't have any land anymore. The land I just sold you for mizonot was lien to the ketuba, so, and now that I sold it to you, I'm now going to collect it back for my ketuba payment. Can she do that? So before they get to the answer, they want to better explain the question. They were really asking was a question based on something that Rav Yosef had said. Rav Yosef said the following: Our melata dezabin. Forget about this particular case. If I am a widow and I sell land from the husband's estate and I sell it with achrayut, that means basically, right, lien property. I say, listen, if some creditor comes and collects this, I'll pay you back. Okay, so she guarantees, it's a guarantee. If she guarantees the property that she sold of the husband's, achrayut ayatmi. Who's responsible in the end when the creditor comes? Not me, because I'm the widow. I'm not the heirs. Who's responsible to give this guarantee? I gave a guarantee, but the guarantee I gave is on the orphans, not on me, okay? Because I don't own the property, right? I have access to it because I'm owed mizonot, I'm owed ketuba money, so I can sell it for my purposes. But if I sell it and there's a lien on it, and some creditor comes along and collects it from them, if I guarantee the property, it's not me who guarantees. They go back to the orphans. That's what Rav Yosef said. So now let's reinterpret the question according to Rav Yosef. What are they asking? Oh, and not only that, by the way, Rav Yosef also said before we go on, Beidin dezabin achrayut ayatmi. If the court came and sold the orphan's property for whatever reason, orphans needed to pay back a loan, the court came in and said, listen, we're selling your property and we're selling it with a guarantee. It's the same thing. The Beit Din's not in charge of the guarantee. It's the orphans who are in charge of the guarantee. Meaning that if a creditor came and took it, and then the buyer would go back to the orphans, even though the orphans didn't sell it to them, right? The orphans would be the ones responsible. So now comes our question. So we're going to reread the question. So what do we say in our case? In our case, the widow sold the ketub, right? The property for her own mizonot, for her food, and she guaranteed it. But her guarantee was for the orphans. So now here comes the question. Kevan de achrayut ayatme tarfa. Since she's not the one who guaranteed it, she can go and collect it and say, oh, but wait, this property, she's just like any other creditor, basically. Since she's not the one providing the guarantee, even though she promised the guarantee, but she promised the guarantee really on the orphans' heads, on their responsibility. So can she now come and say, I'm owed money, I'm taking this land, Oh, guarantee? Fine, go to the orphans. Oh, Dilma matse amrele. Or can the buyer say to her, Nihida achrayu da'alma lo kibilat alavech. Now, you promised me a guarantee, they say to her. Now, we know that you weren't really guaranteeing it, and it was really on the orphans. And you were saying, well, if some creditor, now, here comes the word, some random creditor comes and collects this property, the orphans will guarantee it, but not you. Okay, we get that. But were you not basically committing to us that you won't take it from us? In other words, you were guaranteeing it for some other creditor and for the orphans. Okay, and I understand it wasn't you, it was the orphan. But weren't you at least when you guaranteed it, weren't you guaranteeing that you're not going to collect from us, right? Your own payment, your own, you're also a creditor on this property. We knew that. And we thought your guarantee was including also anything that you would collect, that you were saying, I'm not going to go collect my ketuba from you. So that's the question. Okay. So we're now understanding the question a little better. Since she was a connected party, she wasn't really guaranteeing it, but she did guarantee it in words, even though she really didn't guarantee it before, right, in actuality. But they can claim, or can they claim, well, we at least assumed that you weren't going to recollect it from us. So Amar Le Tanitui. So let's learn it from here. Braita says, this is Rav Sheshet's answer. Mocheret veholechet ad kedei ketubata. If you're a widow and you want to start selling your late husband's property, you can sell it all for your mazonot, but ad kedei ketubata, you have to leave over enough of a chunk of land that you can collect your ketuba from there. V'semachla, and you can rely on that, shetibek ketubata min hash'al. Leave over a piece of land that's the size of your ketuba. And then you can rely on that to collect your ketuba, which sounds like what? Shma mina, shayara in lo shayara lo. It sounds like you can only collect your ketuba from what you leave over. If you didn't leave anything over, then you can't go and collect the ketuba from the people you sold the land to for mazono. No way, no how. Vidilma, to which the Gemara says, who's to say that's what this means? Maybe it's eitzah tova kamashma. Maybe they're just giving you good advice to lo likre la hadranita, so the people on the street won't go talking about you and saying, oh, look at that woman. She sold land and then she demanded it back. Stay far away from that woman, right? People are going to say not nice things about you on the street. And maybe they're saying, right, because what did I do? I sold you my land so that I could have mazonon, and then I demanded the land back on behalf of my ketuba. That really won't make a good reputation for me. So maybe the braitot is just telling you, here's some good advice. If you're going to sell your late husband's property to get mazono, make sure to leave over ketuba, so enough for the ketuba, so that you have what to collect from. Because if you don't do that, right, you're going to end up collecting it for the people you just sold to, and you'll get a bad reputation. But maybe it doesn't mean that you can't. To which the Gemara says, no, you can't read it that way. Because if that's what they meant, it should have just simply said, litany should have said, govak ketubata min hash'al. What did it say? That for sure you'd have to say, which is she sells and leaves over an amount per ketuba. And then it should have just continued and govak ketubata min hash'al. So that way you can collect your ketuba from the rest. But it says v'semechla. Semechla means she can rely on what's left, which sounds like that's all she can rely on. That's what they're going to understand. My semachla, why do they add those words? Shma mina shira in lo shira lo. It sounds like only if she left over and not if she didn't leave over. Before we move on to the next figure, which is totally disconnected, and the commentators try to figure out what this is connected to, I'll suggest suggestion that I think makes the most sense, but you can feel free to read other commentaries on how they connect it. But before I get there was something I wanted to mention about the first sugya. The first sugya was about her selling the land for the mazonot, and then the question was, how big a piece of land could she sell? If you remember, we learned already that according to the Gemara, right, she only collects her mazonot and ketuba from property. She can't collect it from movable property. But the Gaonim came in and said, no, she can also collect it from movable property. I remember because people didn't own land in those days, and the Gaonim changed it all. Once the Gaonim changed it all, this halacha became obsolete. Because when it comes to movable property, it doesn't matter how much you sell. If I have a bicycle, it doesn't matter if I sell one bicycle or 10 bicycles, you'll actually get less money probably if you sell more. So, right, usually people give you a better price. So the whole issue of how much you sell and how much is, the size of the plot of land you sell, which is going to raise the price, the bigger the plot of land you sell, is totally irrelevant when it comes to movable property. So once the Gaonim changed it and people generally collected their mezonah from selling movable property, then it doesn't really make a difference, right? You sell just what you need for that month, and there's none of this sell for 6 months and only get payments of 1 month. That's just an interesting outgrowth of this Mishna, that once things changed, the Gaonim changed things, then it no longer became relevant. Now we get to a fascinating sugya, which you're going to be very surprised, at least I was surprised by the conclusion of this sugya. Actually, it's a very famous sugya in Kiddushin, which really comes there, but it comes up here as well, which is Ibayilhu. Zabin velo itzrich le'lezuze. If I sell my property because I want to buy a new house, and I have a house that I'm planning to buy, so I sell my property so I can have money to put on a down payment for my new house. And then the person who wants to sell me the house decides not to sell it to me after I already sold you my house. And now I have nowhere to live and I want to go back to my house. I don't have another house to buy. So I don't need the money anymore because I was selling my house only because I needed the money. And now I don't need the money to go buy my new house because I don't have a new house to buy. So, hadrezvine or lo hadrezvine? Can I go back on my sale or not? It has nothing to do with a woman, right, and her ketuba, although some people try to connect it. What I think it obviously connects to is this hadranita. And the woman, you don't want to have people call you, oh, you're a woman who reneges on your deals. But despite that, you don't want to have a rumor like that. We're now going to show that this sukkah is going to basically say, if you sell your property, and now this is all if I didn't stipulate. If I stipulated that I'm selling my property, the famous sugya there in Kiddush, you might be aware of it, is where you're selling to make aliyah, and then you can't make aliyah, and then can you get it back? It's very fascinating sugya. It's also about aliyah and all that. Anyway, we'll get there in Kiddushin, Bezrat Hashem. We're getting closer to Kiddushin. So if I sell my land and I don't need the money anymore, hadrezvine or lo hadrezvine, can I basically say, even though I didn't stipulate this at the time, if I stipulate it, then it's a different thing. I made a stipulation. In the event that my house doesn't go through, I'm reneging on this. Then it's totally fine. But what if I didn't say that? And it wasn't clear, it wasn't made clear to you in the beginning that this was dependent on something else. So can I change my mind? So we're going to bring 2 sources to try to prove. Okay, there's a bunch of things in today's daf that are not so clear from the simple reading of the Gemara. It's Rashi and Tosfot, or sometimes Rashi and other commentaries who disagree on, in this case, we're going to disagree on the understanding, are we in the end going to have a proof or not have a proof? It's all about this one line. Does it reject the previous line or does it support the previous line, and blah, blah, blah. We'll get there in a few minutes. But we're going to basically, the structure is 2 sources. One for sure will be rejected. The other we're going to reject as well. But depending on whose commentary you go by, Rashi or Tosfot, maybe we actually reinstate it. Okay, we might reject the rejection. Okay, so now that's actually the way I'm going to read it. I'm going to read it one way. I'm going to read it the way Tosfot reads it, which is based on the Rashbam, which is going to be, we're going to reject the rejection, which means that in the end, we're going to have a second proof. Second proof is going to stand. The first proof is not going to. Tashma, let's learn from here. Tahu Gavra, Dezavin Arale Rav Papa. Case happened. Person sold his land to Rav Papa. He needed to buy oxen. In the end, he didn't need the oxen, okay, for whatever reason. Rav Papa returned him his land. So what do you see here? Seems like you can go back on your sale. So the Gemara says it's not a proof. Rav Papa could simply be that Rav Papa was going beyond the letter of the law. Rav Papa was nice and he said, oh, you need it back? No problem, I'll give it back to you. Okay, but that doesn't mean that the law is that way. Second proof, Tashma. There was a drought, Tahava bin Nahardea, in the city of Nahardea. What happens when there's a drought? There were no grains. So obviously what happens in the shuk, the prices of the grains quadrupled, quintupled, we don't know. They went up really high, skyrocketed, you'll see. Because in order to buy grain, what did people need to do? Could be an exaggerated story, but they sold their palaces. Okay, in order to buy wheat, they had to sell their big palaces. Had no money for wheat. They sold their palaces. All of a sudden, a big boat comes along, full of wheat from somewhere else, brought them a whole slew of wheat, prices dropped in between the time that they sold their palaces to the time that they went to buy the grain. So now they wanted to get their houses back. And Dina Huda, Amalu Rav Nachman said, Dina Huda Hadre Apandal Marai. It's interesting, this Rav Nachman. Why? Because Rav Nachman, if you remember, was the rabbi for the Reish Galuta. The Reish Galuta were the exilarchs, were the wealthy people. It's like the rabbi of the wealthy people. So you could see that he was siding with the wealthy people and said, okay, you want your big mansions back? We'll get them back to you. So what happens? He says, everything goes back. To which they want to say, look, it looks like you can go back on your deal. Now, until now, we've been discussing, you sold your property, thinking one thing, right? And one thing really was the reality. The reality changed after, and you want to now go back on your deal, which seems crazy. We're going to allow this, but that's what they say. To which they say, wait, maybe this is good proof. Why? Maybe this is different. If already the sale was done by mistake, meaning if the wheat was already here, but we didn't know about it, okay? If that happened, right? T1 is when I go sell my big fancy house, okay? T2, we assume, right, the wheat shows up. But maybe there's T0, right? Maybe before I sold my big house, maybe the Igali Milta, maybe what happened in this case was they found out later, okay, after I sold, the boat was already there. The boat was in the dock, was in the harbor. I didn't know about it because I was in the city and there weren't WhatsApps to say, okay, new shipments here and prices are going to drop. So when I sold my big house, I didn't know that at the time the wheat was already there, which means the reality was that before I even sold, I really didn't need to sell. And maybe that would, in that case, I could renege on my deal, but not if the facts change later. Okay, if the boat was on its way from some faraway place, but it wasn't yet here, and then like anything can happen, it could sink, it could, right? Then it's not, it only happened when it arrived here, right? Then it would be a different story. So now this next line is the complicated line. So we tried to bring a proof from here that you could renege on your deal. Then they say, that's not a good proof. So then they say, Ihachi, if that's the case, so I'm going to read it like Tosfot that this rejects. Rashi thinks this supports, and I'm not going to go into Rashi right now, but it's a very convoluted, which is why I preferred Tosfot. Whenever the explanation is simpler, it seems like a better explanation. Ihachi, if that's the case, Hainu da'amar Rami bar Shmuel Rav Nachman. This is what Rami bar Shmuel said to Rav Nachman. In other words, we're going to now have this back and forth with Rami bar Shmuel to Rav Nachman, this back and forth discussion between them, which according to Tosfot, according to Rashbam, only makes sense if you assume the boat wasn't already in the harbor there, in the banks of the river. So let's listen to the conversation and then we'll explain. Rami bar Shmuel says to Rav Nachman, in King, if you're going to allow these people to renege on their deals, you're going to cause people next time not to ever be able to sell their property, because who's going to want to buy knowing that you can renege on your deal? No one's going to want to buy property. So Amarle, Atu, so Rav Nachman says, Atu kol yoma b'tzorta shchicha. What, do you think that droughts happen every day? No, this is a unique situation. We're not going to have problems like this going down toward the future. Amarle, to which Rami bar Shmuel said, what are you talking about? Of course you are. There's a lot of droughts in this area, right? We all know there's areas that are prone to droughts, right? So there's a lot of droughts, and therefore in the Hardea, and therefore this is a common occurrence. Now, so what does this prove, this conversation? That obviously they thought this was a common occurrence. Now, think about the situation. Is it a common occurrence that they sell their big fancy houses and it turns out that already the boat was in the dock, and then that's not really a very common occurrence. It could be a common occurrence that they sell and later on the prices drop and they don't, but to say that the boat was in the dock is already really not such a common occurrence. And therefore, that, according to Tosfot, is a rejection of the rejection, which basically means it wasn't necessarily that it was in the dock already, it was in the banks of the river, and therefore we basically go back to saying we really could learn from here to any other situation. Again, what's the difference? If it was in the banks, then the change happened before the sale. Here, and then the sale was just a mistake, because had they known, they never would have done that. But if it was later, then that would teach us to our situation, which is exactly what we're discussing. Something changed. I was planning to buy your house. We even had a written contract, and then you change your mind, right? You won't sell it to me. So now I want to go back to my original, who I sold my house to, and say, listen, I want my house back. So if that's the case, the way Tosfot reads it, we end up with a proof saying you can, which would then actually work better with the continuation of the Gemara, because if we have no proof, then it's a little strange the Gemara paskins this way, but nevertheless, could be anyway. Hard to believe, but if you sell and you don't need the money in the end, you can go back on your deal. Okay, very interesting halacha. You can look it up, halacha l'maaseh. There's a few more details added and stuff, and also it's based somewhat on the sugya and kiddushin. Anyway, we'll get to it when we get to it there. New Mishna. Almana beimena elusin beimena nisuin, a widow from betrothal or from marriage, mocheret shelo bebeitin, sells her property not in court, meaning a woman. Okay, this is the one we've been talking about. She's a widow. She wants to now sell the property so she can get food payments or ketuba payments. Now here, these are code words for food and ketuba. Erusin from betrothal, remember, she doesn't get food. She only gets, right, arusot don't get food in general from their husbands, so certainly not when they're widowed. They're not going to get food. So almana means ketuba, basically, and minanisuin for marriage means she's getting her mazono payments, her food payments. Okay, either which way, she sells them. She can sell the property not in front of a court. Okay, why? We're going to see in the Gemara. Why doesn't he make her go in front of a court? See why in a minute. Rabbi Shimon Omer, the whole reason to sell it in a court would be to ensure that she's getting the right price. We've talked about this before. Maybe she's going to sell it for cheap because she doesn't really care. She just needs her food payments. She doesn't care about the property of the late husband because it's not hers. She's not an heir. So because of that, there's a concern that maybe she's going to sell it for cheap because she's desperate for the money, and it's always easier that you can get a better price for land if you're desperate. You get a low, and as if you're a buyer, you can kind of get a better price, a better deal if someone's desperate to sell. So we don't require her to go to court to ensure a high price. But Rabbi Shimon Omer, he's going to depend on whether you're getting food payments or ketuba payments. Because she's getting her food. Now, if they made the woman sell always in front of a court to get her food payments, we all know what happens when you go to court. It takes a while. It'll get delayed. What's she going to eat in the meantime? So for food payments, we're going to let her take it immediately. But if it's from betrothal, where she's only getting ketuba, which is that big one lump sum payment, which usually she's not desperate for, we make her go to court. And here comes the explanation. Because she doesn't have mizonot, she's only getting her ketuba. And as long as she doesn't get mizonot, if it's not mizonot, then she has to go to court. Okay, that last line we're going to see, I want you to see it right now, is really somewhat unnecessary. Because if you fill in that almana means, almana from the erusim means she's getting her ketuba, and almana min nisuin means she's getting her food payments, then you don't really need the whole explanation at the end. Now, obviously, we didn't necessarily know that, so maybe we need the explanation, but the Gemara is going to assume that's what it means. Some of the commentaries say, if it was just mezonot and ketuba, why didn't they say mezonot and ketuba? Why did they say nisuin and erusim? It's a little bit of a question. I'm not going to get into all the answers they give, but it's a bit of a strange Mishna in that sense. Would have been simpler if they just said ketuba versus mezonot rather than from betrothal, from marriage, and all that. But this last line we're going to see seems, at least once you say because she doesn't get mezonot, then you could kind of end it there. So that last line is obviously going to be coming to include some other case, which we'll get to soon. So now we need to understand Tanakama. Shimon makes sense. You're getting ketuba, you're not desperate for payments, so we're going to make you do it in the court officially. But if you're getting food payments, we're going to let you get it quickly because you need the food. But the rabbis don't make you go to court either which way. So why is that? And we understand marriage, mishum because of the food payments, same as Rabbi Shimon. My time. But if you're betrothed, why should we make you go to court to get your ketuba money? So two answers. Amar Ulla mishum hina. which every time we have this, we mention Rashi and Tosfot because it's very interesting. In fact, our sugya later is going to definitely lean toward Tosfot's reading of hina, which means what? Rashi says, it's so that the men end up wanting to marry, the men end up finding favor in the eyes of the women, meaning it's always backwards the way you say those words, which means we want the women to get married. So we want to promise them that when it comes time for their ketuba, it's going to be easy for them to sell their husband's property and get their money for their ketuba, and therefore we're going to not make them go to court. And that will enable women to get married from the beginning. The problem with Rashi always is we have all these other sugyot that show that women would always be happy to get married. So you don't necessarily need to go out of the way to incentivize marriage for women. For Tosfot, it's the opposite. It's the incentive is for the men to marry the women now. The woman's, it's not in the beginning, you'll know that you can collect your ketuba. We're now talking about the woman who's standing in front of us right now. We want her to get her ketuba as soon as possible so she can get remarried. It's always easier to get remarried when you have money for your dowry. So we want to let her collect her ketuba quickly, mishum hina. Okay, that's Tosfot. Okay, we're now at the top of Amud Bet. So Ulla says mishum hina, that's the reason why even her ketuba money, we want her to collect quickly, so we're not going to make her go to the court. Rabbi Yochanan amar, the husband's not alive anymore, but when he promised the wife the ketuba, he was telling her, listen, I want you to be able to collect it easily. I don't want you to have to go embarrass yourself in front of a court. Actually, forget the word easily. Not easily. It's just, I don't want to put you in a situation where you have to degrade yourself to go to court and sell the property. Imagine you want to sell your house right now. You have to go and do it in front of a court and have the court get involved. That's a bit of an embarrassment. He doesn't want to embarrass his wife to have to go to court. And therefore, the conditions of the ketuba are, when it comes time and you want to sell my property, you don't have to do it in front of court. That's Rabbi Yochanan. Soon we're going to see two questions on Ulla. Okay, my benayu. Before we get there, what's the difference, la halacha, between them? Ika benayu grusha, a divorcee. If you say it's because of hina, so a grusha also needs hina to get remarried. This, by the way, looks like Tosfot more, because a divorcee needs money, a dowry, to get remarried. It sounds like we're talking about the remarriage. You could explain it to Rashi, grusha nami. In other words, if she ends up being a divorcee, still from the beginning, it doesn't work as well. Anyway, I could try to explain it, but I'm going to leave it right now. But it's not perfect, but it definitely works better like Tosfot, which means she also needs to get remarried, so she needs her money quickly. But if it's that you don't want your wife to humiliate herself, well, grusha lo ichpat. He doesn't really mind bothering his divorced wife, his ex-wife. He doesn't have that same feelings toward her of, oh, I don't want you to be humiliated. Go to court. I'll say, oh, go to court. What do I care? We're divorced anyway. Now, if you don't like that attitude, it's very interesting. There's a great footnote in the Kohen, which talks about in the Yerushalmi, there's actually a sugya that shows that a person doesn't want to humiliate his ex-wife. And they try to reconcile it with this, and then maybe there's difference between there where it's real embarrassment. And this is just, it's not exactly the biggest embarrassment to go to court, right? It's something in between. And that there is this figure which shows the opposite of this, which is interesting. Anyway, it's just an aside. You can look at the footnote if you have it, or ask someone to send it to you. Okay, Tanan. Now we're going to have two questions, one from our Mishna against Ulla. The next Mishna, it's not our Mishna, but the next Mishna, which is at the bottom of the stuff, which we'll learn soon. Ugrusha lo timkor ela bebeitim. A divorcee can't sell unless it's in court. She has to sell it in court. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, that works perfectly. We just said that's the whole difference, right? A normal woman can sell her ketuba according to Tanakama, but a divorcee can't. I'm sorry. A normal woman can sell it even not in court, and divorcee has to go to court. That works perfectly because, again, the whole thing was the husband doesn't want his widow, but his widow, not his ex-wife. But why would a grusha have to go to court to get her ketuba? If you think it's mishum hina, she needs to, again, works well with Tosfot, she needs to get remarried right away. Explain this one also according to Rashi, but basically the chen would be applicable across the board, even according to Rashi, because it was all about getting married in the beginning. What's the difference if she gets divorced or is widow? That wasn't the issue. The issue was from getting married in the first place, or the issue is now getting remarried, which obviously applies to both. To which they answer, don't worry about that last line in the Mishnah, because what are we doing, Ulla and Rabbi Yochanan? They're explaining whose position? Tanakama's. That line, grusha, about the grusha, lo tinkor ela bebeitin, is Rabbi Shimon. Hamani Rabbi Shimoni, who disagrees with Tanakama. Okay, now, what was Rabbi Shimon's position? That if you're only getting your ketuba, then you have to sell it in the court. If you're getting food payments, you don't have to sell it in the court. So then that makes sense. Grusha doesn't need because she has to sell it in the court. Why? Because she's not getting food payments because grusha don't get food payments. Well, that works well, except what? Well, Rabbi Shimon hatana l'reisha. Well, then you could have learned that from our Mishna. We just did, right? We just said the logic is from our Mishna. Hatana l'reisha. It says in the beginning, the first Mishna, right? The one we saw already. Mina echusin lo tinkor. Meaning, if, which we explained already was, and the Mishna said it even, if you're not getting food payments, then you have to sell it in court. That would obviously include a divorcee, so you wouldn't need another line to tell us that Rabbi Shimon thinks a divorcee. So again, our whole logic was to say, don't question from this line in the Mishnah, because this line in the Mishnah isn't the same person's opinion. But if it's not the same person's opinion, it's Rabbi Shimon. If it's Rabbi Shimon, we could have derived that from our Mishnah. You wouldn't need to say it. Well, you might. Also, there's a very hard Gemara, a hard line to understand according to the simple reading. Rashi understands it one way. I'm going to go the different explanation. You might have thought that who delo nafish chen dida. If she's a widow from Erusin, then she's not lo nafish chen dida means she doesn't need a lot of chen to get remarried. What does that mean? She's not so undesirable because she was only betrothed. She never had relations with her husband, right? They were never married. And therefore, it won't be hard for her to get remarried. And therefore, we're going to make her get her ketuba payment in the court because we're not so worried about, marry her off quick because otherwise maybe no one will want to marry her. Aval grusha, but a divorcee is already married, already have relations with her husband, and therefore, maybe even though she's getting her ketuba, which generally the woman has to sell the property in the court, maybe we'll be lenient with her to enable her to get remarried quicker because she's going to have a harder time getting remarried. But even if you say that, and that's why you need that line to come up in the Gemara, the second Mishnah, even according to Rabbi Shimon, hanami tanina. That's also included in our Mishnah. Where? Remember that extra line I told you? Kol she'ein la mizonot. Kol she'ein la mizonot, right? Anyone who doesn't have mizonot in just food payments, in just the ketuba, has to go to the court. We already said that line, which must be including something new, right? Kol means anything. La tuyamai, what's that coming to include? Lav la tuya grusha. Isn't that line already coming? So you might not have assumed the grusha is included. That last line in our Mishnah already includes the divorcee, according to Rabbi Shimon, which again would say then Rabbi Shimon wouldn't need to say it in our Mishnah. Which would take us back to square one and say it must be Tanakama, which means it goes against Ulla, because Ulla said it was all because of chen, and the grusha needs chen, so she should be able to do it not in the court. So to which they say, no. That line, kol she'ein la mizonot, doesn't come to include a divorcee. Really, that next line in the next Mishnah is going to be the divorcee, according to Rabbi Shimon. So what's that line coming to include? Lo la'atuye migureshet ve'ena migureshet. Another complicated line in today's stuff, which again, I like to tell you these things because you might see one commentary and I'm just telling you that I'm reading it according to a different commentary, okay? Because all these lines can be read in many different ways. It's a good example of sugyot where you could read a line one way, you could read it a totally different way. So what's this case? Megureshet ve'ena megureshet is a woman who we call safek megureshet. We're not sure if she's divorced. The classic case they usually bring, he threw her a get, but it landed right within 4 amot of him and 4 amot of her, but it wasn't clear who it was closer to him, closer to her. Right? If it lands in her domain, then it's hers. Her domain is her 4 amot, but not if it's closer to him. So there's a whole debate, right? Then we don't know, is she divorced or not divorced? If she's married, so now we're going to see Kid Rabbi Zera. If you say that she's maybe divorced, maybe married, so now remember, husband has to pay his wife mizono while they're married. He has to feed her. So the husband's obligated her mizono. What does that have to do with anything? Good question, and it's unclear. So Rashi says this means more than what it says. You can see he's clearly adding words. He's obligated her mizono so long as he's alive. As soon as he dies, his orphans are not obligated mizonot, because to take food out of orphans, you have to be sure that the husband has to keep giving her food because maybe she's married. The kids could say maybe she's divorced. We don't have to pay you mizonot. In which case, she's the one who we're talking about. Kol she'en la mizonot, because this Meguresha doesn't have mizonot anymore once he's dead. So that would be a case where she can't sell his property without the court. And that's what's included that line, and therefore you need the grusha to be included in the next Mishna. So that was all to basically explain in a very complicated way that the next line in the Mishna, the last line of the next Mishna, which we thought created a complication for Tanakama, for Ulla's interpretation of Tanakama, is actually not talking about Tanakama at all. It's talking about Rabbi Shimon, and therefore has nothing to do with, is not a question on Ulla. Second question on Ulla, Tashma. Kashem shemocheret shelo bebeitin, kach yorsheh ketubata mochlim shelo bebeitin. Just like she can sell not in the court, also anyone who inherits her ketuba when they're selling property of the orphans also doesn't need to sell it in a court. So Bishlam says just like he doesn't want her to be humiliated, just like he doesn't want her to be humiliated, so he doesn't want her heirs to have to humiliate themselves to go to court. So therefore that makes sense. But hina, well, hina is just so that the woman has a dowry. We're talking about heirs. Heirs are male. What kind of chen is there? It's not like they need money for their dowry to go get married. They're men. To which Ulla would have to explain that. It would have to be a case where her yorsheh, who also don't have to sell it in the court, must be referring to female yorshim, where she only had daughters, let's say, okay, where her sister inherited her food. She didn't have sons. Okay. So 2 questions against Ulla, we explained it. So that was all from 2 explanations of the Mishnah of Tanakama, who said that in any case, she doesn't have to sell in the court. What's the reason? Either so she doesn't have to be humiliated, or she can get the money quickly, mishum hina, either for the first marriage or the second marriage. Machrak ketubata, new Mishnah. If she sells her ketuba, or miktzata, or part of her ketuba, or mishkena ketubata or miktzata, where she sold land of her husband's for all of her ketuba or part of her ketuba. She used land of the husband's for collateral up to the value of her ketuba, miktzata, or part of the value of her ketuba. Like she owed some money and gave them the land as collateral. She gave it as a gift, part of it, right? Land from the husband's property. There was the value of her ketuba or less than the value of her ketuba. If there's any left over, meaning if she still can sell more land because she still is owed ketuba money, she has to do that in court. This to be like before, that she's selling money for ketuba, she has to do it in court. Chacham, which we're going to see, is obviously Rabbi Shimon, even though it doesn't say it's Rabbi Shimon, but that's what we saw in the previous Mishna was Rabbi Shimon. The rabbi said she doesn't need to sell it in court. And in fact, the rabbis here disagree. Chachamim omrim, mochereti afilu arba'a v'chamisha pamim. She could sell it 4 or 5 times, meaning she could do a little bit. U'mocheret lemizonot shelo bebeitin. And she could sell for mizonot even not in court, meaning, what basically they're saying the machloket here is not just about whether she can sell in court or not, but what Rabbi Shimon is adding in the Reisha here, the first part, is that the only thing left for, what did Rabbi Shimon say? If it's mizonot, she could sell it even not in court. Once you start collecting part of your ketuba payment, you can no longer collect food payments, even if you haven't collected your whole ketuba. And the rabbis say, if you've collected part of your ketuba, it doesn't matter. You can still collect food payments. Very interesting, because we always say, once you collect your ketuba, you can't. Well, Tanakama understands, rabbis, not Tanakama, rabbis here, all of her ketuba, once you collect all your ketuba, you can't get food payments. If you didn't collect all of your ketuba, you could get food payments still. And therefore, you could do a shelo bebeitin, because that's what Tanakama says. V'kotevet, but then you should write, lemizonot macharti. You should write, I sold this land for mizonot, because if you go to collect your ketuba later and the kids say, well, you already sold all this property up to the value of your ketuba. So you could say, I sold that for food, not for ketuba. Well, only if you wrote it down, you'd have good proof, right? You say, I'm selling this for food, not for ketuba. Ugrusha lotin korla bebeitin, that was the line we saw before. A divorcee can only sell in the court. So now, matniti mani Rabbi Shimon. So now they say, who's the Tanakama of our Mishnah? As I already said, it's obviously Rabbi Shimon. Titania. Machak ketubata, it says in the braitot. If you sold your ketuba, mishkena ketubata, you gave it as a collateral, or asak ketubati potikila acher, you took out a loan and said, if I don't pay back, take from this property of your husband, your late husband. Ein la mizonot. It's as if you already started giving back the ketuba money, and therefore, as if you already started collecting, and as soon as you collect some, you can't collect mizono payments anymore. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Af al pi shelo machra v'lo mishkana ketubata ela machzita ibda mizonotah. 1 second. Oh, sorry. The Tanakama says if you did the entire thing, then ein la mizonot, or you gave as collateral the entire thing, or even you just said as a potki, but the entire value. Rabbi Shimon comes and says, even part of it, ibda ketubata. So now they say, wait a minute. The rabbis basically hold miktsat kesef kekol kesef. What does that mean, or Rabbi Meir? It means part of the ketuba. Now you have to, it's a little confusing. If I haven't collected part of the ketuba, it's as if I haven't collected any of the ketuba, which means I could still get food payments. That's the rabbis. And Rabbi Shimon Savar, right? They don't view it that way. If I didn't collect all the ketuba, it doesn't matter. I already collected some. It's as if, right? So I can't get mizono payments anymore. For Rabbanan Savar, I'm reading miktsat kesef kekol kesef. A little bit of money, now you have to say it's a little bit of money left over that I didn't collect yet, is as if I didn't collect my ketuba at all. Now, if they're going to hold that miktsat is like cool or it's not kikol, in a totally different machloket about a kohen gadol who can marry only a virgin. So, now if you remember, we talked about this in the beginning of the Masechet. Is a Bulgarian woman over the age of 12 years and 6 months, is she already not a virgin anymore because her body starts changing, and because of that, maybe she's not a virgin anymore. So Ditanya, hu isha b'tulah yikach, right? He has to marry a woman who's a virgin. Prat lebogeret shekalu b'tulah, divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says that excludes a bogeret who doesn't have betulim anymore. Now, she still does. She's still a virgin. She hasn't had relations, but she lost a little bit, right? It's, right? So according to him, and we're going to see in a minute, Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon, machshirim b'bogeret. So now, if you say she has a little betulim, it's as if she has all her betulim. That's miktsat kikulo. That's Rabbi Shimon here. She's a virgin. The rabbis view it more like Rabbi Shimon in the ketuba case. She's more closer to the side of having no betulim anymore. She's like she's as if she collected her whole ketuba. So they seem to say the opposite. To which they say, don't worry about that machlokes. Don't compare them. How to bekrai plige. That whole thing is about the psukim. How to darshan the psukim, because the psukim say bivituleha, which has a 3-part drasha. Could have said betula, could have said bitula, and it actually says bivtula. So we're going to go in three stages. Rabbi Meir savar bitula filu miktsat betulim. Bitula sounds like even if she has some signs of virginity, even if, let's say, she's bogeret. But bitula comes to say adika kula betulim. She has to have all of it, meaning once she gets past a certain age, no, she's not considered a virgin anymore. And then bivtula, this is totally unrelated, bikadarka in shalo kadarka lo. Bivtula comes to say what's considered not a virgin. Let's say she's under the age. It's only if she had relations in a normal manner and not in a shalo kadarka. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon Savre, Betula Shlema Mashma. No, the simple reading of Betula sounds like a complete virgin. The Betula comes to do the exact opposite, to change that. Betula afilu miktsat betulim. Even some of her betulim she's gonna still be included. In other words, first we thought she has to be a complete virgin. Oh no, even if she's a bogeret but still has her virginity. Bivtula yukol betula kayami. But here on the issue of relations, he says, Ben b'kedarka, ben shelo kedarka, whether she has relations normally or she has anal intercourse, it's still going to disqualify her. So basically, the main point here is that don't compare their opinions here, because their opinions there all have to do with drashot on the pasuk, as opposed to here, where it has to do with the conceptual idea and not a drasha from the pasuk. Okay, whether we view part of your collecting your ketuba as if you already collected your entire ketuba, and therefore you can't get mizono payments anymore, that's Rabbi Shimon. Or if we say, no, part is really as if you haven't collected any of it at all. That's miksa kesef kekol kesef. As soon as you have a little bit left, it's as if you haven't collected anything and you could still get your mizono payments. And then, of course, you don't have to do it in court because it's mizono payments. And that goes back to explaining the Mishna. Okay, bit of a complicated daf, a lot of things going on. Sorry, it came out long. Wishing everyone moadim l'simcha, chag sameach, and tomorrow there's no Zoom, but this class will be up as usual, and we'll meet back up on Thursday.